During our lavish anniversary dinner, my husband stood up, clinked his crystal glass, and declared he was in love with another woman. He asked for a divorce right there in front of his entire family. He expected me to shatter into a million pieces. He expected a screaming match. He never expected my chilling response. His smug smile faded when he realized I was not the naive victim he thought I was. My name is Olivia. I am 34 years old and my life changed forever on a Friday night surrounded by expensive floral arrangements and catered food. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly gather your strength while the people you trusted most tried to tear you down. The betrayal did not start that night, but that was the night my blindfold finally came off. It was supposed to be a grand celebration of our 10th wedding anniversary. We were hosting the private dinner at our sprawling suburban estate, a breathtaking home that looked like it was pulled straight from the pages of an architectural magazine. Nathaniel, my husband of a decade, was currently the chief executive officer of a rapidly growing technology startup. He absolutely loved the optics of success. He loved the catered filet mignon, the imported wine, and having his family there to witness his seemingly perfect life. His parents, Richard and Susan, were seated across from me, halfway through their second bottle of wine. His sister Rebecca was mindlessly scrolling on her phone, while her husband Jamal, the only decent person in that entire bloodline, gave me a sympathetic smile from across the long mahogany table. I thought it was just a normal, slightly tense family gathering. Then, Nathaniel tapped his silver fork against his expensive crystal wine glass. The sharp ringing sound cut immediately through the low chatter of the room. He stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his tailored designer suit. I looked up at him with a gentle smile, genuinely expecting a rehearsed romantic speech about our long journey together. Instead, his eyes were completely cold and utterly distant. He cleared his throat loudly and looked around the table. He announced that he could not live a lie anymore. He stated that life was simply too short to be trapped in a miserable marriage that completely lacked passion and true alignment. My heart pounded aggressively against my ribs, but I stayed perfectly still. Then he looked toward the grand entryway of our formal dining room. Right on cue, Brittany walked in. Brittany was 26 years old and the newly appointed public relations director for his company. She was wearing a sleek, revealing designer dress that probably cost more than my first car. She walked right up to the head of the table with absolute confidence, and Nathaniel proudly wrapped his arm tightly around her waist. He kissed her right there in my dining room in front of my catered dinner. When he finally pulled away, he looked down at me with a sickeningly triumphant expression. He told me that Brittany was his true love. He claimed she understood his grand vision in a way I never could, and he demanded a divorce immediately. The heavy silence in the room was so thick it felt physically suffocating. I did not move a single muscle. I did not speak a single word. In that frozen moment, 10 years of memories crashed over me like a violent tidal wave. I looked at the man who was currently parading his young mistress in my home, and I vividly remembered exactly who he used to be. I remembered the desperate man who cried on our cheap apartment floor because he could not secure a single business loan. I remembered the grueling 80-hour weeks I worked as a licensed forensic accountant just to keep a roof over our heads. I remembered crunching complex numbers late into the freezing night, taking on extra corporate audits, and quietly draining my own personal savings to fund his startup while he played the visionary genius. I built the financial foundation of his entire existence. I was the silent, exhausted engine behind his glossy success, and now he was discarding me for a shiny new public relations representative. He truly thought because I was quiet, I was fundamentally weak. He thought because my job involved spreadsheets, I lacked a spine. He was severely mistaken. The family stared at me. I could see the eager anticipation in their eyes. They desperately wanted a dramatic show. They wanted me to throw my heavy wineglass, scream aggressively at Brittany, and drop to my knees, begging him to stay. I slowly looked from Nathaniel to Brittany, and then down at my pristine white linen napkin. The highly analytical part of my brain, the exact part that investigated corporate fraud and dismantled financial criminals for a living, immediately took total control. I felt the sharp, agonizing sting of betrayal, but I pushed it down deep into a locked steel box inside my mind. I allowed exactly one tear to fall down my cheek. Just one single drop. It rolled down my face and landed softly on the table. It was the absolute only piece of my grief they were ever going to get. The silence in the dining room stretched for another long moment before someone finally decided to break it. It was not an apology. It was not a gasp of horror. Instead, my mother-in-law Susan reached across the table and placed her perfectly manicured hand over Nathaniel's. She looked at him with eyes brimming with absolute pride and told him how incredibly brave he was. She actually used the word brave. She praised him for finally stepping into his truth and refusing to settle for a life that did not serve his ultimate greatness. She said she always knew he was destined for a partner who could match his elevated frequency. And she smiled warmly at Brittany. Brittany beamed back like she had just won a prestigious award. I sat there watching this sickening display of validation. Susan had always hated my background. I grew up in the foster system before aging out and putting myself through college with scholarships and grueling shifts at a diner. To Susan, I was just a peasant who had temporarily infiltrated her country club bloodline. Then Rebecca, my sister-in-law, decided it was her turn to twist the knife. She leaned back in her upholstered chair, crossed her arms, and let out a sharp, condescending laugh. She looked me up and down with blatant disgust. She said she always knew I was never high society enough for this family. She claimed I lacked the refinement, the vision, and the aesthetic required to stand beside a chief executive officer. She told me I always looked like a tired accountant playing dress-up in clothes I could not afford. She laughed again and said Nathaniel needed a woman who understood corporate galas and public relations, not someone who spent her weekends reading tax codes and drinking cheap coffee. The cruelty was so casual, so practiced, that it became instantly clear they had all discussed this long before tonight. They had planned this ambush. They had sat around sipping their expensive mimosas on a Sunday afternoon, plotting the exact moment they would discard me. I slowly scanned the room, registering every single face and burning their expressions into my memory. Richard, my father-in-law, was quietly sipping his wine, looking entirely unbothered by the fact that his son had just humiliated his wife of 10 years. The only person in the entire room who looked genuinely sickened was Jamal. Jamal was Rebecca's husband. He was 34 years old, an African-American man who worked as a director of risk management at a major downtown bank. Jamal and I always shared a quiet, mutual respect. We were the only two outsiders who had married into this toxic family, and we often exchanged knowing glances during their narcissistic rants. Right now, Jamal looked like he wanted to flip the heavy mahogany table. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He looked at Rebecca with pure disgust and shook his head, but before he could speak, I subtly caught his eye. I gave him a barely noticeable nod. It was a silent command to stay out of it. I did not need a savior. I needed them to keep talking so I could gather every piece of evidence I needed for what was about to come. They all thought my silence meant I was broken. They mistook my stillness for surrender. Nathaniel puffed out his chest, clearly emboldened by his mother's praise and his sister's venom. He told me it was time to be an adult about this. He said he did not want to make things ugly, but he was moving forward with Brittany, and I needed to understand that the tech startup and this lifestyle belonged to him. He warned me not to make a scene or try to fight him because his lawyers were sharks, and I would only end up embarrassing myself. He stood there holding the woman who had helped him cheat on me, lecturing me about maturity. He truly believed he held all the cards. His arrogance was blinding. He thought I was just going to pack a small suitcase and fade quietly into the background while he enjoyed the fruits of my endless labor. He underestimated my intelligence because he was too busy admiring his own reflection. He expected tears and a desperate emotional breakdown. Instead, I offered him absolutely nothing. I reached up with a steady hand and wiped the tear from my cheek. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold, analytical power return to my veins. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw an insult. I simply looked into Nathaniel's arrogant eyes and asked the one question he never anticipated. "Where are the papers?" Nathaniel blinked. For a fraction of a second, his arrogant facade slipped. He had spent weeks preparing for a massive hysterical fight. He had armed himself with complex legal jargon and defensive arguments ready to justify why he deserved to keep the millions we supposedly had. My completely calm demand short-circuited his meticulously planned performance. He cleared his throat loudly, straightened his expensive silk tie, and reached down into the designer leather briefcase resting beside his chair. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and dramatically slid a perfectly bound document across the polished mahogany table. It stopped right next to my pristine white napkin. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and laced his fingers together. He explained in a condescending tone that this was a post-nuptial agreement acting as a fast-track divorce settlement. He stated very clearly that he would be retaining full ownership of the technology startup, the investment portfolios, and the primary bank accounts. He claimed that since he was the chief executive officer, the wealth was solely generated by his intellect and his public relations efforts alongside Brittany. He graciously offered me a modest payout to help me get back on my feet. Susan leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with malicious anticipation. Rebecca stopped scrolling on her phone, completely captivated by the drama. They were all waiting for me to scream. They were waiting for me to throw the document back in his face and threaten to take half of his empire. Brittany even adjusted her posture, ready to play the victim the moment I raised my voice. Instead, I calmly reached into my tailored blazer and pulled out my favorite heavy metallic pen. It was a pen I had bought for myself after passing my rigorous forensic accounting certification exams. I did not bother reading the first page. I did not scan the asset division clauses. I simply flipped to the last page, where a note indicated the signature line. As a licensed forensic accountant, I knew something Nathaniel clearly did not. A divorce settlement signed when one party is actively hiding fraudulent financial data is not just voidable, it is practically a criminal confession on paper. I also knew that by signing it so quickly, I was giving him a false sense of absolute security. Arrogant men make their biggest and most fatal mistakes when they completely believe they have won. I uncapped my pen and signed my name with a smooth, steady hand. The scratching sound of the pen tip echoed loudly in the painfully quiet dining room. I placed the pen back in my pocket, closed the document, and slid it back across the table toward him. Nathaniel stared at the signed paper, looking utterly confused. His brow furrowed deeply. He looked up at me and asked why I was not even going to read the terms before signing my life away. I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt. I looked down at him and replied that I did not need to read poorly written fiction. I turned my back on the entire table. I walked out of the formal dining room with my head held high. I could feel their stunned silence lingering heavily in the air behind me. No one said a single word as my heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. I walked up the sweeping grand staircase and headed straight into the master bedroom. I pulled my modest black suitcase from the top shelf of the walk-in closet. I moved efficiently, packing only my essential clothing, my personal laptop, and the physical documents I had kept hidden in my locked desk drawer. I purposely left behind every piece of expensive jewelry and every designer handbag Nathaniel had ever bought me. I knew exactly where the money for those gifts had come from, and I wanted absolutely no part of his impending financial fallout. I zipped it shut. I grabbed the handle and walked out into the dimly lit upstairs hallway. As I passed the guest wing, a shadow shifted in the alcove. Jamal stepped out quietly. He looked nervously over his shoulder toward the top of the stairs, listening to the faint murmurs of the family still gathered in the dining room below. Jamal stepped into my path and reached out his hand. He pressed something small, cold, and metallic firmly into my palm. I looked down and saw a tiny encrypted flash drive resting in my hand. He leaned in close, ensuring his voice was nothing more than a faint breath in the quiet hallway. He looked me dead in the eyes and whispered that Nathaniel was hiding massive corporate debt and to not let him destroy me. I closed my fingers tightly around the cold metal of the flash drive. I slipped it into my coat pocket, walked into the bedroom, and locked the door. I did not sleep at all that night. Instead, I spent those dark hours meticulously backing up the encrypted files to a highly secure cloud server that only I could access. I knew I needed to be entirely prepared for the brutal legal war that was coming. The next morning at exactly 7 o'clock, the tranquility of the estate was violently shattered. I was standing in the walk-in closet, folding my last stack of plain cotton sweaters into my modest black suitcase. Suddenly I heard loud banging from the front door downstairs. Before I could even walk out to the landing to see who it was, I heard the electronic deadbolt beep and click open. Nathaniel had already given her the security passcode. Brittany marched into the grand foyer like a conquering general. She was followed closely by 4 burly men. They were carrying heavy moving boxes and furniture. Dollies. She looked up. The sweeping staircase, saw me standing quietly on the landing, and immediately began barking orders. She pointed her finger at my face. She demanded that I vacate the master bedroom right now. She loudly announced that her interior design team was arriving at noon, and she needed my clutter cleared out immediately so they could begin their work. I turned around and walked back into the bedroom. I continued carefully placing my simple clothing into my suitcase. Brittany followed me into the room while the movers lingered awkwardly in the hallway. She stood in the center of the plush custom rug and began inspecting the expensive mahogany bedroom suite. She loudly warned the moving crew to watch me very closely. She claimed she would call the local police and press charges for theft if I dared to pack a single piece of Nathaniel's expensive furniture. She told them to make sure I did not steal any art pieces hanging on the walls or the imported silk curtains. I ignored her completely. I did not care about the imported Italian leather sofa downstairs, or the crystal chandeliers hanging in the formal dining room. I only cared about my financial independence and my exit strategy. As I calmly packed my practical black work shoes, Brittany decided to escalate her verbal attack. She leaned casually against the wooden door frame and crossed her arms over her chest. She looked me up and down with intense disgust. She told me I was pathetic. She said it was no wonder Nathaniel desperately sought comfort and passion in her arms, because I was just a boring, infertile accountant. She claimed I cared much more about my corporate spreadsheets than about building a real, loving family. She laughed cruelly. She said a vibrant, successful tech chief executive officer needed a young, energetic, beautiful mother for his future children, not a cold, calculating robot who could not give him an heir. The cruel jab about my infertility was a highly calculated low blow Nathaniel and I had struggled for several years to conceive. It was a deeply private and devastating pain. It was information he had clearly weaponized and shared with his young mistress, just to make her feel utterly superior to me. But her vicious words did not break me. They only solidified my absolute resolve to destroy them both, financially and legally. I calmly zipped up my small suitcase and pulled the metal handle up with a sharp, decisive click. Brittany took a step back as I rolled my bag toward the bedroom door. She smugly rubbed her hand along the doorframe, acting as if she already owned everything she touched. She proudly bragged that she was going to completely gut the entire house, starting tomorrow morning. She detailed how she planned to tear down the historic crown molding rip out the original dark hardwood floors and replace absolutely everything with a modern minimalist aesthetic. She smiled wickedly and said the renovation was going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, but Nathaniel insisted his true love deserved the absolute perfect dream home. I stopped at the top of the stairs and looked back at her standing proudly in the bedroom. I did not argue with her. I did not scream or tell her she was making a huge mistake. I just offered her a very small, genuinely polite smile. I smiled because as I listened to her loudly boast about her grand expensive renovation plans, I held a massive real estate secret. She and Nathaniel were completely blind to the truth. She was bragging about spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, but she had absolutely no idea whose house she was actually standing in. I turned my back on Brittany and walked down the sweeping staircase for the very last time. The moving crew scrambled out of my way as I pulled my modest black suitcase through the grand foyer. They watched me with wide eyes, clearly sensing the intense negative energy radiating from my entire body, but they wisely chose to remain completely silent as I walked past them. I pushed the heavy oak front door open and stepped out into the crisp morning air. My reliable paid-off sedan was parked at the end of the long circular driveway. It was completely overshadowed by Nathaniel's absurdly expensive imported sports car, but I did not care. I popped the trunk, tossed my suitcase inside, and slid into the driver's seat. As I started the engine, I looked at the sprawling estate through my rearview mirror. Brittany thought she was the queen of a castle she had just stolen, but she was severely mistaken. I bought that house 5 years ago. Nathaniel always bragged to his friends that his startup had finally made enough money to secure a multi-million-dollar mortgage. That was a fabrication. When we were house hunting, his credit was destroyed from maxing out personal cards to fund his early projects. The banks practically laughed in his face, but my financial record was flawless. As a forensic accountant, my annual performance bonuses were substantial. I quietly formed an anonymous limited liability company in a privacy-friendly state. I used my own money to purchase the estate outright in cash under the corporate name. I structured a lease agreement making Nathaniel the official tenant. For 5 years, he had been paying rent directly into my corporate account. He fully believed he was paying a private mortgage broker. In reality, he was just covering the property taxes and padding my investment portfolio. Since the house belonged to my corporation, it was shielded from marital assets. The fast-track divorce settlement he forced me to sign only surrendered my rights to his supposed wealth. It never touched my private holding company. Brittany could plan all the renovations she wanted, but she was legally standing on my property. The moment I decided to terminate the lease, she would be thrown out onto the street. I drove away from the suffocating suburbs and headed straight into the bustling heart of the city. I had already secured a stunning penthouse unit in a highly secure luxury high-rise building downtown. I unlocked the heavy door to my new sanctuary and walked into the expansive living room. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city skyline. The space was completely quiet, immaculately clean, and most importantly, it was entirely mine. I did not even bother unpacking my clothes. I walked straight over to the sleek glass dining table, opened my leather briefcase, and pulled out my heavy-duty work laptop. I immediately connected to my private encrypted server and took a deep, steadying breath. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the tiny metallic flash drive Jamal had slipped into my hand the night before. Jamal was an incredibly smart man. If he was nervous enough to risk his lucrative banking career by handing me internal data, I knew the information had to be catastrophic. I plugged the drive into the port and launched my military-grade decryption software. The progress bar moved agonizingly slowly across the screen. When the secure folders finally unzipped, I started opening the dense financial spreadsheets. My eyes darted across the rows of complex data. What I saw on the screen made my blood run completely cold. Nathaniel was not just running a struggling technology startup. He was actively orchestrating a massive financial fraud. Using my specialized training, I quickly traced a complex web of shell companies and offshore bank accounts hidden in the Cayman Islands. He had been quietly siphoning millions of dollars out of his own corporate treasury for the last 18 months. The funds he claimed were being utilized for software research and development were actually being wired directly to an untraceable private account. I cross-referenced the withdrawal dates with the internal bank invoices Jamal had saved. The sickening truth revealed itself in bright red numbers. Nathaniel was aggressively draining the company dry to fund his secret life. He was not just buying expensive dinners. I found digital receipts for luxury sports cars, exclusive tropical vacations, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-grade diamonds, all purchased under Brittany's name. He was systematically robbing his wealthy investors to buy the affection of his young public relations director. I stared at the glowing screen, knowing I would use every spreadsheet to put him in federal prison. My cell phone suddenly vibrated violently against the sleek glass of my dining table, shattering the quiet atmosphere of my new penthouse. I slowly pulled my eyes away from the damning financial spreadsheets and glanced down at the bright screen. The caller identification displayed the name of my mother-in-law, Susan. I took a deep, steadying breath, allowing the cold logic of my profession to completely settle my nerves before I answered the call. I did not even get the opportunity to offer a polite greeting. Susan immediately launched into an incredibly aggressive and loud tirade. Her voice was shrill, demanding, and dripping with absolute entitlement. She loudly informed me that since I was no longer a welcomed member of their prestigious family, I was legally obligated to return the vintage diamond necklace she had given me on my wedding day. She vehemently claimed it was a priceless family heirloom that had been carefully passed down through 4 generations of high society women. She threatened to call her high-powered attorneys and have me formally arrested for grand larceny if I did not hand the jewelry over to her within the hour. She barked into the receiver that I was nothing but a low-class gold digger who was maliciously trying to steal their historical legacy. I calmly let her yell until she completely ran out of breath and the line went silent. I simply replied that I would meet her at the luxury cafe downtown in exactly 30 minutes, and then I promptly ended the call. I packed my heavy work laptop securely into my leather briefcase and retrieved the small black velvet jewelry box from the bottom compartment of my luggage. The cafe she selected was located in the most affluent and exclusive shopping district of the entire city. When I arrived at the location, Susan was already sitting at a secluded corner table, sipping a complicated espresso beverage. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses indoors, looking entirely out of place in her desperate attempt to appear wealthy and intimidating. I walked over with a straight posture and sat down calmly directly across from her. I placed the velvet box gently onto the cold marble table, but I kept my hand resting firmly on top of the lid. Susan reached for it immediately like a starving animal, but I did not let go of the box. She sneered at me from behind her dark lenses and told me to hand over the necklace before she made a terrible public scene. She leaned in close across the table and began to verbally degrade my background just as she had ruthlessly done for the last 10 years. She viciously said that a broken girl who grew up bouncing around the state foster care system never deserved to wear such an exquisite piece of history. She told me I was born with absolutely nothing and I would inevitably die with absolutely nothing. She claimed Nathaniel was finally waking up from his charitable phase and realizing that a working-class orphan could never properly represent his corporate empire. She spat the cruel words out like toxic venom, deeply hoping to see me break down and cry in the middle of the crowded luxury cafe. I listened to her cruel words without blinking a single eye. I felt absolutely no shame regarding my difficult past. The foster system had taught me extreme resilience, and my working-class roots had taught me the undeniable value of honest hard labor. I was incredibly proud of the deep scars that ultimately built my financial empire. I slowly pulled my hand back and allowed her to snatch the velvet box from the marble table. She opened the lid eagerly. The large teardrop pendant caught the bright ambient light of the cafe and sparkled brilliantly. A look of absolute greed washed over her heavily powdered face. She snapped the box shut, dropped it securely into her designer handbag, and stood up abruptly. She loudly told me to never contact her son or her family ever again. She turned on her expensive heels and marched out of the cafe looking incredibly victorious. I sat there holding my warm coffee mug and allowed a genuine smile to spread completely across my face. Susan thought she had just reclaimed a priceless piece of her grand family legacy. She had absolutely no idea that the real diamond was currently sitting securely inside a safety deposit box. Years ago, Nathaniel had explicitly refused to pay for a basic home security system, calling it a paranoid waste of his valuable money. I quietly took the necklace to a master jeweler to replace the authentic stone with a cubic zirconia. She was now guarding completely worthless fake glass with her life. I smiled again. I left the cafe feeling completely energized by Susan's profound ignorance. I walked back to my secure high-rise building and took the private elevator up to my penthouse. When I sat back down at my sleek glass dining table, I decided it was time to check the status of our shared finances. I opened my heavy work laptop and navigated to the online portal for the primary joint checking and savings accounts I shared with Nathaniel. The screen loaded for a few seconds before flashing a bold red error message: access denied. I tried logging in again using the secondary security questions, but the result was exactly the same. Nathaniel had illegally frozen the joint accounts. He had changed all the administrative passwords and locked me entirely out of the financial safety net we had supposedly built together over the last decade. This was a textbook tactic of financial abuse, and it was incredibly predictable. Nathaniel wanted to completely starve me out of existence. He knew the fast-track divorce settlement he had presented at our anniversary dinner was heavily skewed in his favor, and he assumed I would eventually try to fight it in court. By abruptly cutting off my access to our shared money, he believed he was severely crippling my ability to survive day to day, let alone hire a competent divorce attorney to contest his outrageous demands. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me begging him for basic grocery money so I would be forced to accept his pathetic settlement offer just to keep a roof over my head. He honestly thought I was financially dependent on his tech startup wealth. He was so completely absorbed in his own grandiose ego that he never once bothered to look at my actual income. During our 10-year marriage, I was the one meticulously managing the household budget, while he recklessly spent his venture capital on flashy public relations stunts and lavish parties. Because he found my forensic accounting career incredibly boring, he never asked about my annual performance bonuses or the highly lucrative independent consulting contracts I regularly took on the side. I had quietly amassed a massive private reserve in completely separate bank accounts, securely held under my own name, entirely out of his reach. I did not need a single penny of his tainted money to fight this impending war. I had my own vast financial resources, and I was more than ready to deploy them against him without mercy. I picked up my cell phone and quickly dialed a very specific private number. I did not call a standard family law practitioner who would merely argue over alimony. I directly called Harrison Cole. Harrison was universally known as the most ruthless and terrifying corporate litigation attorney in the entire city. He specialized in dismantling fraudulent corporate executives and tearing apart complex financial structures. His massive upfront retainer fee alone would have made Nathaniel sweat profusely, but I paid it upfront without a single moment of hesitation. When Harrison answered the phone, his voice was incredibly sharp and deeply professional. I calmly explained the entire situation regarding the hidden offshore accounts, the stolen corporate funds, and the fast-track divorce settlement Nathaniel had arrogantly pushed across the dining room table. Harrison immediately recognized the massive legal leverage we currently possessed. He offered to file an emergency injunction to unfreeze the joint accounts and drag Nathaniel into a brutal public hearing by the end of the week. I firmly told him no. I explicitly instructed Harrison to stay completely in the shadows for now. I wanted Nathaniel to genuinely believe his starvation tactic was working perfectly. I wanted him to think I was entirely unrepresented, terrified, and completely incapable of fighting back against his aggressive legal team. Let him operate under the absolute false assumption that he was the smartest person in the room. Harrison chuckled darkly and fully agreed to the stealth strategy. We began quietly drafting the elaborate legal trap that would eventually obliterate Nathaniel's entire existence. As I was confirming the final billing details of Harrison's retainer agreement, a sharp notification tone echoed loudly from my laptop speakers. I minimized the banking portal window and opened my personal email inbox. An automated message had just arrived from the Human Resources Department of Nathaniel's technology startup. The subject line was written in cold, formal corporate language. I clicked on the message and quickly scanned the brief paragraph. It was an official termination of benefits notice. Nathaniel had maliciously canceled my comprehensive health insurance policy, effective immediately. He was not just trying to bankrupt me, he was actively trying to strip away my fundamental security, leaving me completely vulnerable. He was playing a very dangerous game, and I was finally ready to end it. Nathaniel's aggressive financial tactics were unfortunately just the beginning of their coordinated attack. Since his cowardly attempts to starve me out were secretly failing, he decided to deploy his new public relations director to destroy my character. Brittany was exceptionally skilled at manipulating public perception, and she quickly found her perfect stage on social media. 2 days after my health insurance was maliciously canceled, I received a text message from a concerned former colleague. The message contained a direct link to a viral video on a popular social media platform. I clicked the link and watched as Brittany's face filled my computer screen. She was sitting in the back of Nathaniel's imported sports car, wiping away fake tears. She recorded a highly dramatic 3-minute monologue claiming she had bravely rescued a brilliant tech chief executive officer from a profoundly toxic and financially abusive marriage. She painted a completely fabricated picture of me. She described an imaginary lazy wife who refused to work, spent his hard-earned corporate money frivolously, and coldly denied him any emotional warmth. She carefully omitted my name, but her followers quickly pieced the highly specific details together. The video had already amassed over 2 million views by the time I watched it. Brittany did not stop there. Over the next 48 hours, she launched a relentless digital campaign, painting herself as the ultimate savior. She posted highly edited clips of the luxury estate, falsely claiming I had hoarded all the wealth while forcing Nathaniel to sleep in the guest room. The comment sections were absolutely flooded with thousands of strangers brutally attacking my character. They called me a gold digger, a parasite, and a textbook narcissist. Brittany's narrative was heavily curated to generate maximum outrage. As a licensed forensic accountant, my entire professional reputation was meticulously built on strict integrity and absolute trustworthiness. Having millions of people falsely accusing me of financial abuse was not just a minor personal annoyance, it was a legitimate threat to my highly lucrative career. My corporate clients required absolute discretion and untarnished public records. I could have easily panicked. I could have aggressively posted my own videos desperately trying to defend myself to a mob of angry strangers, but I knew that reacting emotionally was exactly what Brittany desperately wanted. Instead of crying, I approached the viral videos with the exact same cold calculation I used during a massive corporate audit. I opened a fresh encrypted folder on my secure server and meticulously documented absolutely everything. I did not just save the video files. I utilized specialized software to capture the exact metadata, the timestamps, the specific engagement metrics, and the localized viewer demographics. I took thousands of high-resolution screenshots of her most damaging claims. In the state where we resided, publishing false statements that directly endangered a person's professional livelihood constituted defamation per se. Brittany thought she was bravely sharing her truth, but she was actually handing me a massive watertight civil lawsuit wrapped in a beautiful digital bow. Every single time she uploaded a new tearful update, she was legally compounding the massive financial damages she would eventually be forced to pay me. I spent hours cataloging her digital footprints, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. My years of tracking white-collar criminals had perfectly trained me for this exact moment. I simply sat back and watched her eagerly dig her own grave in front of a massive global audience. The situation took a drastically darker turn on the third evening of her relentless smear campaign. I was sitting at my glass dining table reviewing the offshore bank account files when my cell phone suddenly lit up with an unknown caller identification. I ignored it. 10 seconds later, another random number called. Then a different number sent a highly aggressive text message calling me a disgusting parasite. Within 3 minutes, my phone was aggressively vibrating off the table, flooded with hundreds of hateful messages and threatening phone calls from completely random area codes across the country. I immediately refreshed Brittany's most recent viral video to see what had triggered this sudden massive influx of harassment. I scrolled down to the top pinned comment. It was written by an account I immediately recognized. It was Rebecca, my incredibly bitter sister-in-law. She had publicly commented on the video, falsely validating every single one of Brittany's absurd lies. She claimed she had personally witnessed me emotionally abusing her brother for 10 agonizing years. But she did not stop at spreading vicious rumors. At the very end of her viral comment, Rebecca had maliciously typed out my direct personal cell phone number, instructing the internet trolls to let me know exactly how they felt. I stared at the glowing screen of my cell phone as hundreds of hateful text messages continued to flood my inbox. Rebecca had completely crossed a dangerous legal line by weaponizing an angry online mob against me. I calmly powered down the device, severing their direct access to my peace of mind. I knew I needed to change my number eventually, but right now I had far more pressing matters to attend to. My secondary encrypted work phone suddenly chimed from inside my leather briefcase. Only a handful of trusted corporate clients and one specific family member possessed that highly secure number. I pulled the device out and opened the encrypted text application. It was a brief message from Jamal. He asked me to meet him immediately at an underground parking garage located 3 blocks away from my high-rise building. He explicitly stated that he had left his own personal cell phone at his house, so his location could not be digitally tracked by his wife. I threw on a heavy trench coat, grabbed my briefcase, and walked the short distance to the designated meeting spot. The concrete garage was dimly lit and completely deserted at this late hour. Jamal was leaning against the cold cement wall next to his dark sports utility vehicle. His arms were tightly crossed over his chest, and the sheer exhaustion deeply etched into his face was undeniable. As an African American man who had worked twice as hard as anyone else to become a director of risk management at a prestigious downtown bank, Jamal had zero tolerance for financial foolishness. He was a man deeply rooted in logic and unwavering moral integrity. When I approached him, he did not offer a polite greeting. He simply looked at me with eyes full of absolute quiet fury. Jamal told me that he had spent the entire weekend conducting a thorough forensic sweep of his own personal household finances. What he discovered had completely shattered his marriage. Rebecca had always been incredibly jealous of Nathaniel's supposed entrepreneurial success. She desperately wanted to be seen as a crucial angel investor in his upcoming $50 million initial public offering. Jamal explained that his wife had secretly forged his signature on multiple financial documents. She had systematically drained their 7-year-old daughter's entire college savings fund. She took every single penny they had diligently saved and illegally wired it directly to Nathaniel's failing tech startup. She framed it as a massive personal loan, fully expecting a massive return on investment when the company went public next week. Jamal clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned completely pale. He said she stole their child's future just to buy her brother's toxic validation. I listened in completely stunned silence. I knew Nathaniel was aggressively draining his investors, but I never imagined Rebecca would actively participate in the financial slaughter of her own immediate family. Jamal looked at me and stated clearly that he was entirely done playing the supportive husband to a woman who possessed absolutely no moral compass. He refused to let his daughter suffer because of their narcissistic greed. He told me he was quietly filing for full custody and a brutal divorce, but he needed my specialized help to ensure Rebecca and Nathaniel could never touch his remaining assets. We stood together in the freezing underground garage and officially formed an incredibly dangerous underground alliance. We were the two outsiders, the only two people who had ever truly worked for our wealth, and we were now ready to burn their toxic family empire to the completely ground. I explained my master plan regarding the offshore accounts and the impending civil lawsuits. Jamal nodded in absolute agreement. He told me that my current financial data was excellent, but I was still missing the final nail in the coffin. To completely destroy a corporate executive before a massive public offering, I needed irrefutable proof of internal corporate fraud, straight from the source. Jamal reached into the inner pocket of his wool overcoat. He pulled out a small folded piece of thick cardstock paper and handed it directly to me. I opened the heavy paper and stared at the sequence of complex alphanumeric characters neatly written in black ink. Jamal leaned in close and whispered that his banking institution had recently underwritten a small bridge loan for Nathaniel's company. During the routine risk assessment phase, Jamal had quietly memorized the highly restricted administrative credentials. He told me those were Nathaniel's direct Internet Protocol access codes to the primary financial mainframe of the startup. I smiled coldly at Jamal and thanked him for his incredible bravery and absolute trust. I held the heavy paper tightly, knowing he had just handed me the absolute power to legally execute my husband. I left the freezing concrete parking garage and practically sprinted the 3 short blocks back to my secure high-rise building. My heart was pounding aggressively against my ribs, but my mind was completely clear. I gripped the heavy cardstock paper in my pocket, like it was a winning lottery ticket. As soon as I walked into my penthouse, I locked the heavy steel deadbolt and rushed straight to my glass dining table. I opened my heavy work laptop and quickly booted up my highly customized forensic accounting software. I carefully unfolded the paper Jamal had given me and stared at the string of administrative credentials. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second before I quickly typed the complex Internet Protocol access codes into the secure login terminal. The screen went entirely black for a tense moment before a green authorization prompt flashed brightly across the monitor. I was finally in. I had completely bypassed the external firewalls and successfully entered the primary financial mainframe of Nathaniel's technology startup. The sheer volume of digital records currently sitting in front of me would have easily overwhelmed a standard corporate accountant, but I was definitely not a standard accountant. I was a certified public accountant specifically trained to hunt down arrogant white-collar criminals who thought they were clever. Nathaniel always mocked my intensely meticulous nature. He used to laugh at me during lavish dinner parties, telling his wealthy friends that I was a human calculator, incapable of creative visionary thinking. He claimed I was overly obsessed with small technical details and completely blind to the big grand picture. As I began running highly complex data queries on his internal corporate ledgers, I realized his arrogant dismissal of my professional skills was his absolute greatest miscalculation. My intense lifelong obsession with meticulous details was exactly what was going to put him in a federal penitentiary. I started the thorough investigation by cross-referencing the hidden offshore bank account numbers Jamal had previously provided with the official corporate expense reports. It took me less than 45 minutes to uncover a massive and highly coordinated scheme of aggressive wire fraud. Nathaniel was utilizing a series of completely fake vendor invoices to deliberately justify transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the company treasury. He was actively writing off Brittany's luxury sports cars, exclusive vacations, and expensive diamond jewelry as legitimate corporate marketing expenses. The resulting tax evasion implications alone were absolutely staggering and undeniably criminal. But the deeper I dug into the encrypted private files, the more terrifying the financial reality became. He was not just stealing a small fraction of the quarterly profits. He was fundamentally destroying the entire organizational structure from the inside out. I opened a highly restricted digital folder labeled Series B Funding and carefully examined the original capital investment contracts. My highly trained eyes immediately caught a glaring inconsistency in the electronic digital signatures. I pulled up the official public corporate filings and placed them side by side on my large monitor. The executive signatures on his internal documents were completely fabricated. Nathaniel had aggressively forged the legal signatures of two major venture capitalists to fraudulently secure additional high-interest bridge loans from several downtown banking institutions, including Jamal's Bank. He was actively using new illegal corporate loans to quietly pay off the massive compounding interest on his older illegal loans. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme meticulously hidden behind the glamorous, wealthy facade of a booming technology startup. The sun was slowly beginning to rise over the city skyline, but I did not feel a single ounce of fatigue. I finally compiled all the raw financial data into a comprehensive master balance sheet to accurately determine the actual current valuation of his entire company. When the final analytical algorithm finished processing, the numbers appeared on the screen in bright, bold red font. I leaned back in my chair and let out a sharp, heavy breath of absolute disbelief. Nathaniel's tech company was practically and undeniably bankrupt. The massive corporate bank accounts he constantly bragged about to his naive family were completely empty. The upcoming $50 million initial public offering he was planning to celebrate on Friday was built entirely on a fragile, fraudulent house of cards. He was preparing to sell a completely hollow shell of a company to a major tech conglomerate. When the acquiring conglomerate inevitably discovered the forged signatures and the empty bank accounts, Nathaniel would rapidly face decades in federal prison. He truly thought he was freely discarding me so he could enjoy his massive wealth with a much younger woman. He had absolutely no idea that I was currently holding the match that was going to burn his entire fraudulent empire straight to the ground. I closed the heavy laptop and allowed myself a rare moment of genuine satisfaction. The digital match was successfully struck, and now I just needed to carefully prepare the massive explosion. But before I could finalize my legal strategy with Harrison, my cell phone buzzed loudly against the glass table. I received a highly urgent notification from the concierge desk downstairs. A legal courier had just dropped off a thick, certified envelope requiring my immediate signature. I took the private elevator down to the lobby, signed the digital pad, and carried the heavy envelope back up to my penthouse. I ripped open the thick paper and pulled out a stack of highly aggressive legal documents. It was a formal letter from Nathaniel's high-priced divorce attorney. The legal documents were explicitly designed to terrify a normal person. His attorney aggressively threatened to drag me through a brutal multi-year financial discovery process. He claimed they would subpoena every single personal bank account, every corporate client file, and every business contract I had ever touched in my entire career. He promised to make my daily life an absolute living nightmare unless I immediately signed a strict total non-disclosure agreement. The agreement demanded my absolute silence regarding the inner workings of his tech startup, his personal finances, and his relationship with Brittany. He was desperately trying to gag me before his initial public offering went live on Friday. He knew his fraudulent empire was fragile, and he viewed me as a liability. An ordinary woman facing a relentless multi-million-dollar legal team would have crumbled under the immense pressure. Nathaniel was counting on my supposed weakness. He expected me to panic, call a cheap family lawyer, and eventually surrender out of financial exhaustion. He had absolutely no idea that his aggressive legal threat was practically a joke to a certified public accountant who had already downloaded his entire fraudulent corporate server. I did not feel a single ounce of fear reading his ridiculous demands. Instead, I felt a brilliant opportunity to legally trap him even further. I decided to give his massive ego exactly what it desperately craved. I was going to play the role of the terrified, broken victim perfectly. I opened my personal email and began typing an emotional message to Nathaniel. I deliberately used frantic language and desperate pleas for mercy. I told him the legal threats were destroying my mental health and keeping me awake at night. I begged him to call off his aggressive attorneys and promised I would never say a single word about his failing company or his young mistress to anyone. I wrote that I was exhausted, terrified of losing my forensic accounting career, and willing to do absolutely anything just to make the legal nightmare stop. I purposely made myself sound entirely defeated, isolated, and financially broken. I read over the panicked message one last time, ensuring it sounded genuinely desperate before I confidently hit send. I did not have to wait long for his response. Less than 20 minutes later, my encrypted work phone chimed with a text message from Jamal. Jamal had been quietly sitting in the family group chat all morning, meticulously observing their toxic dynamic. He sent me a direct screenshot of Nathaniel's latest message to the family. Nathaniel had eagerly taken a digital screenshot of my desperate pleading email and proudly sent it to his parents and his sister. In the family group chat, Nathaniel was boasting about his victory. He proudly declared that he had finally broken me completely. He laughed about how easily I had surrendered under the weight of his high-powered legal team. Susan immediately replied with several clapping emojis praising her son for his dominant and ruthless business tactics. Rebecca chimed in shortly after calling me a pathetic loser who finally realized her proper place in the world. They were all celebrating my supposed emotional and financial destruction. I stared at the screenshot Jamal sent me and smiled a cold and calculating smile. Nathaniel was so blinded by his own narcissistic arrogance that he failed to realize what he had just done. By publicly boasting to his family and distributing my email, he had formally documented his own malicious intent. He had provided me with written evidence of legal extortion and emotional harassment. He thought he was proving his dominance to his mother and sister, but he was actually just handing my attorney another lethal weapon. He had successfully documented his own illegal intimidation tactics right before a major federal investigation. His massive ego had just driven the final nail into his own coffin, and I was more than ready to bury him. I was going to make absolutely certain that he paid for every single lie he had ever told. I was going to make absolutely certain that he paid for every single lie he had ever told. 2 days later, I found myself sitting in the freezing, heavily air-conditioned conference room of his expensive legal firm. The formal mediation was scheduled for 10 in the morning, but Nathaniel deliberately made me wait for 45 minutes. It was a classic power play designed to make me feel small and insignificant. When the heavy glass doors finally opened, he strolled into the room wearing a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car. He was not alone. Brittany trailed right behind him, clinging tightly to his arm and carrying a designer handbag. She had absolutely no legal right to be present during our confidential divorce mediation, but I did not object. Having her sit there with a smug, superior smile perfectly fueled the desperate victim persona I was carefully projecting. Nathaniel's lead attorney was a ruthless-looking man who spoke in a fast, condescending monotone. He immediately took control of the meeting, sliding a thin, legally binding document across the long mahogany table. He did not even bother to make eye contact with me. He bluntly stated that his client was feeling exceptionally generous, despite my supposedly erratic behavior over the past few days. The attorney explained that Nathaniel was willing to offer me a one-time lump sum settlement of exactly $100,000. In exchange for this pathetic amount, I would have to permanently surrender any and all claims to the technology startup, the investment portfolios, and any future earnings. I would also have to sign the ironclad non-disclosure agreement, ensuring I never spoke a single word about his private affairs to the press or the public. $100,000 was an absolute insult. It was less than a fraction of a percent of the $50 million valuation he was currently boasting about to his naive investors. It was also less than the amount of money he had illegally wired to a Cayman Islands account just to buy Brittany a luxury sports car. But I did not let my intense anger show on my face. Instead, I let my shoulders slump forward heavily. I stared down at the polished wood of the table, deliberately avoiding his arrogant gaze. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap and allowed my breathing to become shallow and unsteady. I looked exactly like a woman who had been completely crushed by the immense weight of a relentless legal machine. Nathaniel leaned back comfortably in his plush leather chair and let out a soft, arrogant chuckle. He could not resist the overwhelming urge to kick me while he genuinely believed I was down. He told me it was the best deal I was ever going to get. He loudly gloated about his upcoming multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. He bragged that major industry titans were fighting over his visionary software, and that by the end of the week, he would officially be one of the wealthiest tech executives in the entire state. He looked at me with absolute pity and said it was a shame I lacked the intellectual capacity to keep up with his massive success. Brittany chimed in, adding that the settlement money would be more than enough for me to rent a quiet little apartment somewhere far away from their glamorous new life. I sat there in total silence, letting their cruel insults wash over me. I slowly reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the settlement document toward my side of the table. I picked up the heavy black pen the attorney had provided. I kept my head bowed and my voice intentionally small and fragile. I softly told Nathaniel that I was completely exhausted. I said I could not fight him and his expensive lawyers anymore. I admitted that my mental health was rapidly deteriorating, and I just desperately wanted this terrible nightmare to be completely over. I looked up from the document and met his arrogant eyes. I told him I would gladly accept the $100,000 and sign the strict non-disclosure agreement. I would walk away completely and permanently. But I stated clearly that I had one single non-negotiable condition. I demanded that his high-powered legal team expedite the paperwork and have the final divorce decree officially stamped by a superior court judge this Friday. I insisted that if the paperwork was delayed even a single day past Friday, the entire deal was off, and I would take my chances in a lengthy public trial. Nathaniel completely lit up with absolute triumph. He quickly agreed without a second thought. He was so blinded by his own massive ego that he entirely missed the lethal significance of that specific deadline. He just wanted to be a legally single man before his massive corporate event. He had absolutely no idea that Friday was the exact day of his lavish initial public offering launch party, and he certainly did not know that by rushing the legal separation, he was voluntarily severing his only remaining protective tie to my vast hidden wealth right before the federal agents arrived. Friday morning arrived with heavy gray clouds hanging low over the city skyline, but the weather did not dampen Nathaniel's high spirits. We stood together in the sterile, brightly lit courtroom of the Superior Court judge. Nathaniel was practically vibrating with eager anticipation. He wore a tailored charcoal suit specifically chosen for his massive initial public offering launch party, scheduled for that exact same evening. His attorney stood next to him looking equally smug as he handed the final fast-track settlement documents directly to the court clerk. I stood quietly on the opposite side of the heavy wooden table, wearing a modest gray dress. I kept my shoulders slumped, maintaining my carefully constructed facade of a completely broken woman. The honorable judge peered down at us over her thick reading glasses. She briefly reviewed the heavily expedited paperwork, noting the highly unusual speed of our financial settlement. She asked one final time if I fully understood the permanent legal implications of signing away my marital rights for a mere $100,000. I kept my voice intentionally soft and trembling as I verbally confirmed my formal agreement. I told the judge I just wanted to move on with my life peacefully. The judge sighed softly, shaking her head at what she clearly perceived as a terrible financial mistake. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel and struck the dark-sounding block. With a loud, definitive thud, she declared our 10-year marriage completely dissolved. She stamped the final divorce decree with thick red ink, severing our legal ties forever. Nathaniel let out a sharp, audible breath of absolute relief. He vigorously shook his attorney's hand, flashing a brilliant, triumphant smile. He looked over at me with eyes full of arrogant pity. He mockingly wished me the best of luck in my quiet little life and warned me to spend my meager settlement money wisely. I did not say a single word in response. I simply nodded slowly, clutching my heavy leather briefcase tightly to my chest. That briefcase held the encrypted flash drive containing the absolute destruction of his entire corporate existence, but he genuinely thought it just held my pathetic personal belongings. I turned around and walked out of the quiet courtroom, my heels clicking against the marble floors. When I pushed through the glass doors and stepped out onto the concrete steps, Brittany was eagerly waiting for us. She was wearing an inappropriate designer cocktail dress, ready to start celebrating their massive corporate victory early. When she saw me walk out alone, she immediately strutted over, blocking my path to the parking lot. She crossed her arms and let out a loud, obnoxious laugh that echoed across the plaza. Brittany sneered at me and loudly congratulated me on finally accepting my inevitable defeat. She maliciously bragged that she and Nathaniel were heading straight to the luxury venue to prepare for the biggest night of their lives. She told me they were going to be filthy rich by midnight while I sat alone in a cheap apartment eating microwave dinners. She whispered that I should use my settlement money to buy decent clothes because I looked pathetic. Nathaniel walked out of the courthouse doors just in time to catch her cruel performance. He did not stop her. He wrapped his arm around her waist and kissed her deeply, right in front of me. They laughed together, acting like victorious villains in a cheap movie. I maintained my absolute silence. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I simply walked around them and headed straight toward my reliable paid-off sedan parked at the far edge of the crowded lot. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled the heavy door shut. The loud click of the automatic locks echoing in the quiet cabin was the absolute best sound I had heard all week. The very second I was safely isolated inside my car, my entire demeanor violently shifted. The slumped shoulders vanished completely. The fragile trembling completely stopped. The terrified victim persona instantly evaporated, leaving behind nothing but pure, ice-cold determination. I opened my heavy leather briefcase and pulled out the thick dossier of irrefutable financial evidence I had meticulously compiled. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my highly secure encrypted work phone. I quickly dialed a highly specific unlisted federal number. A stern automated voice answered the call, prompting me for a directory option. I pressed the corresponding number and waited patiently for a human agent. When the federal agent finally answered, I calmly stated that I possessed irrefutable documentary evidence of massive wire fraud, tax evasion, and forged investor signatures regarding a highly publicized tech startup. I was making an official anonymous tip to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The federal agent on the other end of the secure line was initially quite skeptical. They receive hundreds of bitter divorce-related calls every single week from angry spouses seeking petty revenge. But I did not give them emotional complaints. I gave them exact offshore routing numbers, specific transaction dates of forged investor signatures, and the precise federal statutes Nathaniel had blatantly violated. I spoke the cold, clinical language of a licensed, certified public accountant. The agent's tone immediately shifted from dismissive board routine to highly alert urgency. He gave me a secure direct digital drop link and a physical mailing address for the regional field office. I ended the call, placed the encrypted phone back into my pocket, and drove straight back to my secure high-rise building. The gray clouds above the city were finally breaking apart. It was time to build the ultimate trap. When I arrived at my penthouse, I transformed my sleek glass dining table into a highly classified tactical war room. I opened my heavy leather briefcase and pulled out my primary work laptop. For the next 14 hours, I did not eat or sleep a single wink. I sat in complete, focused silence, meticulously compiling every single piece of financial evidence into a devastatingly clear narrative. I drafted a highly comprehensive 300-page investigative dossier detailing every single crime. I painstakingly cross-referenced every fraudulent wire transfer with the exact corresponding Internal Revenue Service tax codes regarding intentional tax evasion and offshore asset hiding. I mapped out the forged venture capital bridge loans directly linking them to severe Securities and Exchange Commission violations concerning fraudulent initial public offerings and deceptive corporate practices. I made absolutely sure my financial analysis was entirely bulletproof. I did not just provide raw, confusing data for them to slowly decipher. I spoon-fed the federal investigators a fully completed criminal case ready for immediate prosecution. I printed the entire 300-page document using my heavy-duty office printer. I punched holes in the thick stacks of warm paper and secured them tightly inside 3 massive black leather binders that felt incredibly heavy in my tired hands. I used bright red plastic tabs to highlight the specific fraudulent invoices Nathaniel had used to illegally purchase Brittany's luxury vehicles. I used bright blue plastic tabs to explicitly flag the forged signatures of the downtown banking executives, including the highly classified risk assessment documents Jamal had helped me verify. Every single page was perfectly organized, mathematically undeniable, and absolutely lethal to Nathaniel's entire corporate existence. I packed the heavy black binders into 3 secure waterproof shipping boxes and sealed them tightly with heavy industrial packing tape. Timing was the absolute most critical component of my entire master plan. I did not want Nathaniel to simply receive a polite federal audit notice in the mail next month. I wanted maximum public destruction. I wanted him pulled straight off his golden pedestal exactly when he felt the most untouchable. By utilizing a highly trusted overnight courier service, I guaranteed the physical boxes would land directly on the desks of the lead federal investigators by Tuesday morning. The digital copies were already rapidly uploading to the secure government server. This precise schedule gave the federal agents exactly 3 days to verify the offshore routing numbers and present my watertight evidence to a federal magistrate judge. By Thursday afternoon, the massive arrest warrants would be officially signed and sealed. By Friday evening, exactly when Nathaniel was hosting his lavish $50 million corporate acquisition gala in front of everyone, the trap would violently snap shut without warning. I carried the heavy cardboard boxes down to the lobby and handed them directly to the overnight courier. I watched the delivery truck pull away from the curb, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace and quiet satisfaction. The legal machinery was now officially in motion, and absolutely nothing could stop it. I returned to my penthouse and poured myself a glass of cold water. As I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the glowing city skyline, my encrypted work phone chimed with an urgent financial news alert. I tapped the glowing screen and opened the breaking notification. The major technology conglomerate that was preparing to purchase Nathaniel's startup had just issued a sudden and shocking press release to the public. Due to an anonymous tip regarding irregular bridge loans, the acquiring firm was immediately launching a formal and highly aggressive due diligence audit of his entire company. The audit was scheduled to conclude on Friday, perfectly aligning with the launch party. The ultimate countdown to his total destruction had officially begun. The ultimate countdown to his total destruction had officially begun. By Wednesday morning, the entire city was buzzing with the news of the upcoming Friday night gala. Nathaniel was hosting a massive luxury event at the most exclusive downtown ballroom to formally announce the $50 million acquisition of his technology startup. Despite the fact that his corporate accounts were completely drained and he was secretly drowning in forged bridge loans, he had somehow managed to squeeze out one final line of credit to fund this extravagant party. He hired private celebrity chefs, imported thousands of rare exotic flowers, and rented a fleet of luxury vehicles for his executive team. He was determined to project the absolute perfect image of a highly successful self-made tech billionaire before the ink on the final acquisition contract was even dry. He genuinely believed that if he threw a big enough party, the acquiring conglomerate would completely ignore the glaring holes in his financial ledgers. That afternoon, I took the private elevator down to the lobby of my high-rise building to check my secure mail terminal. Nestled between a few standard utility bills was a thick, heavy envelope made of expensive textured cream paper. It did not have a standard printed mailing label. My name was written across the front in sweeping, elegant calligraphy. I carried the heavy envelope back up to my penthouse and carefully sliced it open at my glass dining table. Inside was a massive gold foil VIP invitation to Nathaniel's exclusive acquisition gala. I stared at the shining gold letters, feeling a brief moment of complete confusion. Nathaniel was arrogant, but he was not usually stupid enough to invite his freshly divorced forensic accountant ex-wife to a highly sensitive corporate event. Then, a small folded piece of matching cream stationery fell out of the thick envelope and fluttered softly onto the glass table. I picked up the small note and immediately recognized the heavily slanted handwriting. It was from my former mother-in-law, Susan, and my bitter sister-in-law, Rebecca. In an act of pure, unadulterated sadism, they had secretly conspired to mail me a VIP pass to the event. The handwritten note was incredibly cruel. Susan wrote that she wanted me to see exactly what I had missed out on by being so small-minded and unsupportive. Rebecca added a vicious postscript, telling me to come watch Nathaniel publicly celebrate his true love, Brittany, and properly introduce her to high society. They desperately wanted me to stand quietly in the back of the crowded ballroom, wearing my practical work clothes, while the entire city celebrated my ultimate replacement. They were hoping to humiliate me one last time, to break whatever tiny fragments of my spirit they thought were still left standing. I read the toxic note twice, and then I actually laughed out loud. The bright sound echoed through my empty penthouse. They thought they were handing me a weapon of emotional destruction, but they had just personally delivered a golden ticket to the absolute greatest show on earth. I was not going to hide in my apartment and cry while federal agents raided his party. I was going to walk right through the front doors and watch his entire fraudulent empire burn to the ground from the absolute best seat in the house. I immediately pulled out my laptop and began making intense preparations. I did not just want to attend the gala, I wanted to completely dominate the room. I hired an elite professional hair and makeup team demanding their absolute best premium service for Friday evening. Then I went directly to an exclusive boutique downtown and purchased a breathtaking tailored red gown that commanded absolute power and attention. I genuinely wanted to completely obliterate the boring, invisible accountant persona they had constantly forced upon me. I walked back to my dining table and picked up the heavy gold foil invitation. I pulled out my favorite heavy metallic pen and checked the box marked attending with a sharp, decisive stroke. I sealed the RSVP card in the return envelope, knowing Susan and Rebecca were going to be absolutely horrified when they realized I actually had the nerve to accept their cruel trap. Once the envelope was sealed, I picked up my encrypted work phone and dialed a highly secure corporate number. I was not calling the federal agents this time. I was calling the lead due diligence investigator at the major technology conglomerate that was supposedly acquiring Nathaniel's company. The lead investigator answered on the second ring. I smiled coldly and told him I had some highly sensitive internal financial documents he absolutely and urgently needed to review before his chief executive officer signed a $50 million check on Friday night. Friday evening finally arrived, bringing a crisp, cool breeze to the bustling downtown streets. The luxury event venue Nathaniel had rented was absolutely spectacular. It was a massive historic ballroom adorned with cascading crystal chandeliers and towering pillars of imported white marble. A long velvet carpet was rolled out across the grand entrance, flanked by a fleet of expensive black vehicles. Paparazzi and local business journalists were gathered outside, eagerly taking photographs of the city elite as they arrived to celebrate the highly publicized tech acquisition. I sat quietly in the back of my hired luxury car, smoothing the fabric of my breathtaking tailored red gown. The dress was an absolute masterpiece of modern design, hugging every curve perfectly and radiating an undeniable aura of absolute power and fierce confidence. I paired it with sleek high heels and a bold crimson lipstick that perfectly matched the silk fabric. The elite hair and makeup team had completely transformed me. I no longer looked like the exhausted practical forensic accountant Nathaniel had so easily discarded. I looked like a woman who owned the entire building. My driver opened the door and I stepped out onto the bustling sidewalk. The cool evening air washed over me as I walked confidently up the marble steps and handed my gold foil invitation to the heavily armed security personnel standing at the grand entrance. The guard scanned the barcode, nodded respectfully, and pulled open the massive oak doors. I stepped inside the venue and instantly felt the heavy pulsating energy of the crowded room. Hundreds of wealthy investors, corporate executives, and socialites were mingling, holding delicate crystal champagne flutes and laughing loudly over the soft classical music playing in the background. I walked slowly down the sweeping grand staircase leading directly into the main ballroom. I did not try to blend into the shadows or hide in the corners. I kept my head held incredibly high, letting the vibrant crimson silk of my gown catch the bright ambient light of the chandeliers. It did not take long for people to notice me. The dull roar of casual corporate chatter slowly began to fade away as heads turned in my direction. Whispers started echoing rapidly through the crowded ballroom. People recognized me from the viral social media smear campaign Britney had so maliciously orchestrated. They expected to see a completely broken, pathetic woman crying alone in a cheap apartment. Instead, they saw a highly confident, striking woman radiating total control. The sudden shift in public perception was immediate and absolutely palpable. I scanned the large room and quickly spotted the family standing near the center stage. They were gathered around a massive, towering display of exotic white lilies. Nathaniel was holding a fresh glass of expensive bourbon, looking incredibly smug and self-satisfied. Brittany was clinging tightly to his arm, wearing an overly flashy silver sequined dress that looked incredibly cheap under the harsh ballroom lighting. When Nathaniel finally looked up and saw me walking toward them, his entire body froze. His smug, arrogant smile completely vanished. He stared at me with wide eyes, his jaw slightly dropping in pure shock. For a brief, unguarded moment, he looked entirely captivated by my transformation. He had spent the last 10 years deliberately trying to make me feel small and invisible, and now he could not take his eyes off me. Brittany noticed his sudden intense distraction and immediately followed his gaze. When she saw me standing there looking absolutely flawless, her face twisted into a mask of pure, jealous rage. She aggressively yanked his arm, breaking his hypnotic stare and pulling his attention back to her. She hissed something into his ear, but he barely seemed to register her angry words. He just kept nervously adjusting his expensive silk tie, looking completely panicked by my unexpected arrival. He knew I had eagerly accepted the pathetic $100,000 settlement. He genuinely believed I was completely terrified of his legal team. My confident presence at his $50 million party completely shattered his false sense of absolute security. Rebecca and Susan were standing right next to them holding their champagne flutes. When Susan finally spotted me, her face turned a bright shade of furious purple. She actually dropped her delicate crystal glass, letting it shatter loudly against the polished marble floor. She could not fathom how a girl from the foster system had the absolute audacity to crash her high society celebration wearing a dress that likely cost more than her own. She completely lost whatever tiny shred of composure she possessed. Susan aggressively pushed her way through the crowd of wealthy investors marching directly toward me with her hands balled into tight, angry fists. She loudly demanded that the venue security immediately intervene and remove me. Two towering security guards quickly approached us looking highly intimidating in their dark tailored suits. They politely asked me to step toward the exit to avoid causing a public disturbance. I did not flinch or take a single step backward. Instead, I calmly reached into my designer clutch and pulled out the thick gold foil VIP invitation. I handed it directly to the head guard. I told him my name was clearly printed on the exclusive guest list and that I had every legal right to be standing exactly where I was. The guard inspected the expensive textured paper, scanned the barcode with his handheld device, and nodded respectfully. He stepped back, turning toward my furious mother-in-law, and stated clearly that I was a verified guest. Susan looked like she was going to have a complete breakdown right there on the polished marble floor. Her face flushed an even deeper shade of angry purple as she realized her cruel little prank had completely backfired. She had invited me as a joke, and now she was trapped with my presence. Brittany watched this entire exchange with absolute disgust. She hated the fact that I was commanding so much positive attention. She absolutely hated that Nathaniel was still staring at my red silk gown. She decided that if the security team was not going to forcefully remove me, she was going to ruin my night herself. She turned around and aggressively snatched a completely full glass of dark red wine from a passing waiter. She gripped the crystal stem tightly and began marching directly toward me. Her eyes were locked onto the pristine crimson fabric of my expensive dress. I could see the malicious gears turning rapidly inside her head. She was planning to deliberately douse me in sticky wine to ruin my flawless appearance and force me to run out of the ballroom in utter humiliation. She picked up her pace, pretending to stumble clumsily on the thick velvet carpet as she closed the distance between us. She let out a highly theatrical gasp, throwing her arms forward in a completely fabricated attempt to catch her balance. The heavy crystal glass tilted violently, launching a massive wave of dark burgundy liquid straight toward my chest. But she entirely underestimated the people standing around me. Jamal had been quietly observing the toxic family dynamics from the very edge of the floral display. He knew exactly how petty and vindictive Brittany could be. The absolute second she grabbed that glass of red wine from the silver tray, he started walking toward my side of the room. Just as the dark liquid left the glass, Jamal reached out with his strong hand and firmly grabbed my shoulder. He swiftly pulled me backward in one smooth, highly coordinated motion out of the direct line of fire. The massive splash of dark red wine flew right past me, entirely missing my beautiful silk dress. Instead, the heavy burgundy wave crashed directly into the person standing immediately behind me. It was Susan. The dark liquid hit her right in the center of her chest, instantly soaking into the delicate white fabric of her expensive designer gown. The red wine splashed aggressively up into her face and dripped down her expensive pearl necklace. The entire ballroom suddenly went dead silent. The soft classical music seemed to fade completely into the background as hundreds of wealthy guests stopped mingling and turned to stare at the absolute disaster unfolding near the center stage. Susan stood frozen in pure shock, looking down at her completely ruined white dress. The dark stain was spreading rapidly across the bodice, looking like a massive, gruesome injury. She let out a piercing, high-pitched shriek of absolute horror that echoed off the high ceiling. Absolute chaos immediately ensued. People began whispering aggressively and pointing their fingers. Brittany stood there holding her empty crystal glass, looking completely terrified by what she had just done. She had intended to publicly humiliate me, but she had just effectively destroyed the mother of the chief executive officer in front of his most important financial investors. Jamal did not miss a single beat. He stepped directly in front of me, acting as a solid protective barrier against the family. He looked at Brittany with intense, absolute disgust. His deep voice boomed loudly across the quiet ballroom, carrying perfectly over the hushed whispers of the elite corporate crowd. He loudly reprimanded Brittany, telling her that she was clearly incredibly drunk and entirely too clumsy to be attending a high-class corporate event. He asked her what was wrong with her and demanded to know why she was throwing alcohol on her future mother-in-law. He completely flipped the entire narrative, exposing her as a reckless, pathetic public liability. He completely flipped the entire false narrative, exposing her as a highly reckless, pathetic public liability. The wealthy investors standing nearby began muttering in agreement, stepping away from Brittany as if her sheer incompetence was highly contagious. Nathaniel realized he was rapidly losing control of his incredibly expensive narrative. He desperately needed to redirect the attention of his extremely important corporate guests before the entire evening collapsed into a massive high society gossip scandal. He quickly signaled the audio technician standing nervously near the massive floral display. A loud, sharp feedback noise briefly echoed through the towering speakers, immediately silencing the chaotic whispers of the stunned crowd. The bright overhead spotlights instantly shifted away from the embarrassing mess on the floor and locked directly onto the center stage. Nathaniel practically sprinted up the wooden steps, desperately trying to salvage his $50 million illusion. He aggressively grabbed the silver microphone and forced a brilliantly fake smile across his face. He completely ignored his mother, who was still quietly sobbing over her ruined designer dress. He completely ignored the glaring reality that his young mistress had just made an absolute fool of herself in front of his elite investors. Nathaniel cleared his throat loudly and launched directly into a highly rehearsed speech dripping with absolute narcissistic delusion. He welcomed the elite crowd and began loudly boasting about his incredible entrepreneurial journey. He painted a completely fictional picture of himself as a brilliant, self-made visionary genius who had built a massive technology empire entirely from the ground up through sheer willpower and unmatched intellect. He spoke passionately about the grueling late nights and the massive personal sacrifices he supposedly made while deliberately erasing every single hour of forensic accounting labor I had ever contributed to his ultimate survival. He told the wealthy investors that his innovative software was going to fundamentally revolutionize the entire global market and secure their financial legacies for decades to come. He paced across the stage, projecting the absolute perfect image of a dominant, untouchable tech billionaire. Then he made his most sickening move of the entire evening. He lowered his voice into a tone of fake humility and looked directly at Brittany. He announced to the massive room that a truly successful man is only as great as the supportive woman standing firmly by his side. He completely omitted our 10-year marriage and boldly introduced his public relations director as his ultimate muse and his one true love. He claimed Brittany was the primary driving force behind the massive upcoming corporate acquisition. He eagerly invited her to join him on the brightly lit stage. Brittany tried to look elegant as she walked up the wooden stairs, but she was visibly shaking from Jamal's highly public reprimand. Her cheap silver dress sparkled awkwardly under the heavy spotlights as she stood next to him, forcing a very tight, unnatural smile for the flashing cameras of the local business journalists. I did not feel a single ounce of jealousy or anger as I watched them play pretend on the stage. I slowly walked away from the messy scene on the floor and positioned myself at the very back of the grand ballroom near the massive oak doors. I quietly accepted a fresh glass of expensive champagne from a passing waiter and took a slow, deliberate sip. The crisp, cold liquid tasted exactly like absolute victory. I leaned against a cool marble pillar and casually checked the thin silver watch secured around my left wrist. It was exactly 8:15 in the evening. The formal due diligence audit, conducted by the acquiring conglomerate, was officially concluding, and the federal warrants were already signed and sealed. I simply watched the second hand tick forward, knowing their glamorous fairy tale was mathematically expiring in a matter of minutes. Nathaniel was loudly celebrating a massive financial victory that literally did not exist. Nathaniel triumphantly raised his crystal glass and called the chief executive officer of the acquiring technology conglomerate to the stage to officially formalize their massive historic partnership. He expected a warm, enthusiastic speech and a massive ceremonial check to present to the eager photographers. A tall, older man wearing a sharp black suit slowly walked up the wooden steps and approached the microphone. The bright spotlights illuminated his extremely rigid posture, but the tall, older man did not look excited. He did not raise his glass to return the celebratory toast. His face was incredibly pale and deeply grim. He stared at Nathaniel with an expression of absolute corporate disgust. The heavy silence in the room suddenly felt incredibly dangerous. He did not offer a polite greeting to the eager crowd. He simply grabbed the heavy metal microphone stand with a tight grip and took a very long, deep breath. The tall, older man looked out over the sea of expectant faces, his expression completely devoid of any celebratory joy. The massive ceremonial check representing $50 million was resting on a silver easel right next to the podium, waiting for his highly anticipated signature. He did not even glance at it. He adjusted the microphone and his deep, authoritative voice echoed through the silent ballroom. He stated that he had flown into the city tonight, fully prepared to finalize a historic technology acquisition and merge their two incredible companies. He paused, allowing the heavy tension to build. Then he announced with absolute cold precision that as of 8:15 this evening, his board of directors had officially voted to terminate the entire acquisition agreement, effective immediately. A collective gasp rippled through the massive crowd of wealthy investors and corporate elites. People began exchanging highly panicked glances. Nathaniel physically stumbled backward as if he had just been punched directly in the chest. His carefully constructed smile completely disintegrated. The older chief executive officer did not stop speaking. He leaned closer to the microphone and explained exactly why they were pulling out of the deal. He revealed that an urgent anonymous tip had triggered a highly aggressive emergency due diligence audit of Nathaniel's entire corporate financial structure. He stated that his elite team of independent forensic investigators had just concluded their deep dive into the internal ledgers. What they discovered was not just a few minor accounting errors. He loudly declared that they had uncovered severe financial discrepancies, including massive hidden debts, unverified offshore wire transfers, and highly questionable bridge loans that severely violated fundamental corporate ethics and standard legal practices. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The wealthy investors who had personally poured millions of dollars into Nathaniel's startup began shouting angrily, demanding immediate answers. Flashbulbs from the local business journalists started firing rapidly, capturing every single second of Nathaniel's highly public professional execution. Brittany covered her mouth with both hands, looking completely terrified as the glamorous fairy tale she had desperately stolen instantly turned into a massive criminal nightmare. Nathaniel completely panicked. His face turned a sickly shade of pale gray, and thick beads of sweat quickly formed on his forehead. He aggressively lunged forward and physically ripped the heavy silver microphone right out of the older man's hands. His voice cracked with sheer desperation as he yelled into the speakers, begging the furious crowd to just calm down. He frantically claimed that this was all just a massive, terrible misunderstanding. He swore on his life that his technology company was highly profitable and structurally sound. He tried to laugh it off, blaming a simple clerical error made by an incompetent junior accountant. He desperately insisted that if everyone just gave him 24 hours, he could easily provide the correct paperwork to prove his absolute innocence and secure their massive investments. Nobody believed a single word he said. The older chief executive officer simply shook his head in absolute disgust. He stepped away from the podium, completely refusing to engage in a pathetic public screaming match with a desperate fraud. He looked Nathaniel dead in the eyes and stated clearly that there was no clerical error and no misunderstanding. He informed Nathaniel that his legal team was already formally handing all the newly acquired audit data directly over to the federal authorities. He advised Nathaniel to stop talking and immediately secure a very good criminal defense attorney. The older man turned his back on the disgraced startup founder and slowly walked down the wooden stage steps. The massive crowd of angry elites automatically parted for him, creating a wide, clear path through the center of the grand ballroom. Nathaniel remained frozen on the brightly lit stage, clutching the useless microphone, while his entire fake empire collapsed violently around him. Brittany slowly backed away from him, trying to physically distance herself from the massive radioactive fallout. The tall chief executive officer walked straight down the velvet carpet, ignoring the frantic shouts of the panicked investors. He walked right past the massive floral displays and headed directly toward the back of the room. He walked with immense purpose, his eyes locked entirely on me. I remained completely still, leaning casually against the cool marble pillar, holding my crystal glass of champagne. I did not break eye contact as he approached. When he finally reached the back of the room, he stopped directly in front of me. The loud, chaotic shouting of the entire ballroom seemed to completely fade away. He looked at my striking red gown and the absolute fierce confidence radiating from my posture. Then, to the absolute shock of every single person watching, he slowly bowed his head respectfully, acknowledging the brilliant forensic accountant who had just saved his conglomerate $50 million. I returned his respectful bow with a slight nod of my own. I handed my crystal champagne glass to a nearby waiter and stepped away from the cool marble pillar. The path the older chief executive officer had cleared through the massive crowd was still entirely open. I walked down the center of the velvet carpet, heading straight for the brightly lit stage. The heavy, chaotic murmurs of the wealthy investors slowly died down as they watched me approach. They recognized me as the discarded ex-wife, but the immense power radiating from my posture completely contradicted the pathetic narrative Nathaniel had carefully fed them. I climbed the wooden steps with absolute grace, the crimson silk of my gown flowing beautifully behind me. I walked right past Nathaniel, who was currently staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked like a cornered animal completely stripped of his arrogant bravado. I bent down and picked up the heavy silver microphone he had carelessly dropped on the polished wooden floor. I tapped the metal grate twice to ensure it was still active. The sharp, rhythmic sound echoed loudly through the towering speakers, demanding absolute silence from every single person in the grand ballroom. I looked out over the sea of elite corporate guests and then glanced at the audio technician standing nervously near the floral display. I pulled a sleek black remote control from my designer clutch and pointed it directly at the massive projection screen hanging suspended above the center stage. I had quietly slipped the audio technician a generous cash tip earlier in the evening to connect my secure wireless drive to the main visual feed. With a single click of the button, the giant screen flickered to life. The glamorous, branded graphic of Nathaniel's tech startup vanished instantly. It was completely replaced by a stark black and white legal document. The sudden appearance of the complex financial contract caused a fresh wave of confused whispers to ripple rapidly through the crowded room. I raised the microphone to my lips and allowed my voice to project with absolute icy clarity. I introduced myself not as the bitter ex-wife of a visionary genius, but as a licensed, certified public accountant specializing in forensic financial investigations. I told the audience that since they had all generously invested millions of dollars into this technology company, they deserved to see the absolute truth regarding its current financial reality. I pressed the remote again, highlighting a specific paragraph on the massive screen. I explained that exactly 8 months ago, Nathaniel's company had officially run out of operating capital. His lavish parties, his expensive public relations campaigns, and his massive personal embezzlement had completely drained the corporate treasury. To keep the struggling company afloat and to artificially inflate his valuation before the initial public offering, Nathaniel secretly sought out emergency funding. He bypassed traditional banking institutions because his credit was entirely destroyed. Instead, he took out a highly predatory $5 million bridge loan from an anonymous private venture capital firm. The crowd gasped audibly as I highlighted the absurdly high interest rate and the brutal collateral terms permanently attached to the loan agreement. I explained that Nathaniel had recklessly leveraged every single remaining asset he possessed, including his own personal equity in the startup, to secure that desperate cash injection. He had gambled the entire future of the company on the absolute certainty that the $50 million acquisition deal would close successfully tonight, allowing him to quietly pay off the massive hidden debt before anyone ever noticed. Nathaniel lunged forward, desperately trying to grab the microphone from my hand, but Jamal immediately stepped up onto the stage and physically blocked his path. Jamal shoved him backward, forcing him to stand helplessly beside a completely horrified Brittany. I did not even flinch. I turned back to the crowd and highlighted the final signature page of the massive legal contract displayed brightly on the screen above us. I read the strict default clause aloud, emphasizing every single legal term. The contract explicitly stated that if the $5 million principal plus all compounded interest was not paid in full by midnight tonight, the venture capital firm would legally seize absolute control of the entire corporate entity. I looked Nathaniel directly in his panicked eyes and delivered the final lethal blow. I announced to the silent room that I was the majority shareholder of that anonymous venture capital firm. I had used my own private wealth to secretly fund his pathetic lifeline. I checked my watch, smiling coldly. I told him since the acquisition was cancelled, he possessed no capital to repay the loan. I announced that as of midnight he was in total default, and I officially owned his entire company. Nathaniel stared at me for a long, terrifying second before his entire reality violently fractured. The color completely drained from his face, but the sheer panic quickly morphed into an aggressive, hysterical rage. He aggressively pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and screamed at the top of his lungs that I was completely bluffing. He shouted that a boring forensic accountant could never outsmart a visionary tech founder. He desperately turned back toward the sea of horrified investors gripping the edge of the wooden podium. He yelled that my legal documents were entirely fabricated and that I was just a bitter, jealous ex-wife desperately trying to ruin his historic night. He frantically promised the wealthy crowd that his legal team would crush my pathetic little stunt by Monday morning. He was literally sweating through his custom-tailored charcoal suit, practically hyperventilating as he desperately clung to the absolute delusion of his own greatness. Brittany took another slow step backward, visibly trying to disappear into the heavy velvet curtains behind the stage. She wanted absolutely nothing to do with the sinking ship she had so eagerly stolen from me just a few weeks prior. I did not even have to verbally respond to his pathetic screaming. The universe delivered my brilliant punchline for me. Just as Nathaniel opened his mouth to shout another desperate lie, a massive echoing boom completely shattered the heavy tension inside the grand ballroom. The towering heavy oak doors at the very back of the luxury venue were violently thrust open. The sudden aggressive movement drew a collective sharp gasp from the hundreds of elite corporate guests. A highly coordinated team of federal agents immediately flooded into the elegant space. They were not wearing expensive formal wear. They were wearing dark tactical windbreakers with bright yellow letters boldly printed across their backs. Agents representing the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation marched directly into the lavish party. The loud classical music was abruptly cut off, leaving only the heavy rhythmic sound of tactical boots stomping forcefully across the polished marble floors. The incredibly wealthy investors immediately scattered, parting like a massive frightened sea, to create a wide, clear path for the fast-approaching federal authorities. The lead federal investigator, a tall, broad-shouldered man with an incredibly stern expression, walked briskly down the center velvet carpet. He did not pause to politely greet the wealthy socialites or the terrified corporate executives standing completely frozen in their expensive designer clothing. He marched with absolute undeniable purpose straight toward the brightly lit center stage. Nathaniel stood entirely paralyzed behind the wooden podium. His mouth was hanging slightly open, but absolutely no sound came out. The arrogant tech billionaire persona he had spent the last 10 years meticulously crafting completely evaporated in the span of 5 short seconds. The lead agent confidently climbed the wooden stairs and stepped directly onto the stage. He did not look at me or Brittany. He locked his intense gaze completely on my former husband. The federal agent pulled a thick folded document from the inside pocket of his tactical jacket and held it up directly in front of Nathaniel's incredibly pale and profusely sweating face. He spoke with a booming authoritative voice that easily carried across the completely silent ballroom. The agent formally announced that he was executing an official federal arrest warrant, authorized by a superior magistrate judge. He loudly listed the massive, devastating charges for the entire room of investors to hear. He cited multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, severe corporate embezzlement, massive tax evasion, and intentionally defrauding private venture capitalists. As the federal agent listed every single financial crime, the wealthy elite crowd began loudly murmuring in absolute horror, realizing their massive investments were entirely gone. 2 additional armed agents quickly stepped up onto the stage, outflanking Nathaniel from both sides. Nathaniel finally found his voice and began to sob hysterically, begging the officers to wait and promising he could easily explain everything if they just let him call his lead corporate lawyer. The highly trained agents completely ignored his pathetic, desperate pleas. The lead officer firmly grabbed Nathaniel's trembling right arm and aggressively spun him around, forcing him to face the expensive white floral display. He pulled Nathaniel's arms tightly behind his tailored suit jacket. The cold, heavy metallic sound of the steel handcuffs, clicking securely around Nathaniel's wrists, echoed sharply through the quiet ballroom, confirming his absolute total destruction. Susan completely collapsed into the strong arms of a nearby waiter, unable to process the horrific reality that her golden son was officially a federal criminal. She wept uncontrollably as the bright flashes from the journalist's digital cameras captured every single humiliating second of his public arrest forever. As the heavy oak doors closed behind the agents dragging my former husband out of the ballroom, the flashing of the cameras finally began to slow down. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then a sharp, desperate scream shattered the quiet. Brittany stomped her high heels against the marble floor, her face contorted in a mix of pure panic and indignant rage. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. She screamed loudly that I could not do this to them. She yelled that even if the tech startup was gone, she and Nathaniel still had their multi-million-dollar estate. She frantically reminded the room that I had signed the divorce settlement a few hours ago, giving up all my rights to the property. She bragged through tears that she had already hired contractors to rip out the floors tomorrow morning, and the mansion belonged entirely to her now. I watched her throw a massive temper tantrum in the middle of a ruined corporate gala. Her utter desperation was almost comical. I turned away from the stage and walked over to the small cocktail table where I had rested my designer clutch. I opened the clasp and pulled out a crisp manila envelope. I did not raise my voice or try to match her screaming. I walked back toward her, holding the envelope with both hands. I looked her up and down, taking in her cheap silver dress and her ruined makeup. I calmly informed her that she was mistaken about the terms of my legal surrender. I told her I gladly signed the settlement and walked away with $100,000 because I knew Nathaniel was broke. But more importantly, I explained that I never surrendered my rights to the sprawling estate because Nathaniel never actually owned a single brick of that house. Brittany stopped screaming and stared at me with wide, confused eyes. Her brain was unable to process the words I was speaking. I pulled a stack of certified legal papers from the envelope and held them up for her and the remaining guests to see. I explained the reality of the situation using simple terms so her panicked mind could easily understand. I told her that 5 years ago, I used my own lucrative forensic accounting bonuses to purchase the entire estate in cash. I registered the property under an anonymous limited liability company that I entirely controlled. I explained that for 5 years, Nathaniel had simply been paying monthly rent directly into my corporate bank account, entirely under the delusion that he was paying a private mortgage broker. I told her the house was completely shielded from our marital assets, and the divorce settlement she bragged about never touched my private holding company. Nathaniel was nothing but a standard tenant, and she was nothing but an unauthorized guest living completely rent-free on my personal property. The devastating truth hit Brittany like a massive freight train. Her jaw dropped open and the arrogant entitlement drained from her entire body. She looked around the room, desperately searching for someone to defend her, but the wealthy investors were just staring at her in absolute disgust. Even Rebecca, who had been standing nearby watching the entire confrontation, could not find a single cruel word to say. The luxurious fantasy life Brittany thought she had stolen from me was entirely fabricated. She did not have a wealthy tech billionaire husband. She did not have a booming corporate empire. And she absolutely did not have a sprawling historical mansion to gut and redecorate. She was suddenly homeless and entirely tied to a man who was currently sitting in the back of a federal vehicle facing decades in prison. She started shaking violently, realizing she had traded her youth and professional reputation for an absolute mirage. I reached back into the manila envelope and pulled out one final sheet of paper. It was a formal legal document printed on bright yellow paper with a bold black heading. I stepped directly into Brittany's personal space, forcing her to look me dead in the eyes. I shoved the bright yellow paper firmly against her chest, until she instinctively raised her trembling hands to take it. I told her that since Nathaniel was no longer residing at the property, his tenant lease was officially terminated. I informed her that the document she was currently holding was a formal 24-hour eviction notice for trespassing on private property. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile that completely shattered her remaining sanity. I leaned in close so only she could hear the absolute finality in my voice. I told her to get out of my house by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, or I would have the local police drag her out by her hair. Brittany scrambled backward, stumbling over her cheap silver dress, and practically ran out of the grand ballroom, leaving her designer clutch forgotten on the floor. I turned my attention away from her pathetic retreat and looked back toward the center stage. Susan was no longer crying softly into the arms of the venue waiter. The shock of seeing her golden child hauled away in federal handcuffs was rapidly wearing off, and the horrifying financial reality of the situation was finally sinking into her completely panicked brain. During the last few months, Nathaniel had not just forged the signatures of downtown banking executives to secure his illegal bridge loans. He had also quietly convinced his aging parents to legally co-sign several massive lines of corporate credit using their pristine suburban home and their retirement portfolio as primary collateral. Susan realized, with absolute terrifying clarity, that her son was not the only one going down. When the federal authorities inevitably froze Nathaniel's assets and the anonymous venture capital firm officially liquidated his bankrupt company, the massive aggressive creditors would immediately come directly for her. She was going to lose absolutely everything. The lavish country club memberships, the expensive designer gowns, the sprawling suburban house she loved to brag about, and every penny of her retirement savings were entirely gone. The suffocating weight of her impending total bankruptcy hit her so incredibly hard that her knees actually buckled underneath her. She violently pushed her way past the remaining stunned investors and stumbled directly toward me. Susan completely ignored the ruined red wine stain covering her chest and threw herself onto the cold, polished marble floor right at my feet. She dropped to her knees and grabbed the bottom edge of my crimson silk gown with trembling, desperate hands. The arrogant, cruel woman who had spent a decade relentlessly degrading my foster care background was now openly sobbing and begging me for absolute mercy. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her heavily powdered face, completely abandoning whatever tiny shred of high society dignity she had left. Susan frantically pleaded with me to use my massive private wealth to somehow stop the federal investigation. She begged me to pay off the forged venture capital loans and save their family home from immediate foreclosure. She cried that I was the only person with enough money and legal power to fix this massive disaster. She practically choked on her own tears, promising that if I just bailed them out, she would finally treat me like a real daughter and welcome me back into their prestigious family with open, loving arms. I looked down at her completely pathetic display, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, analytical precision. I gently but firmly pulled the expensive crimson silk fabric of my gown right out of her desperate, trembling hands. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, forcing her to look up at me from the cold, hard floor. I did not raise my voice, but my words cut through the quiet ballroom like a sharply sharpened blade. I told her that she never actually wanted a real daughter. I calmly explained that she only ever wanted a silent, obedient servant who would blindly fund her arrogant son's grandiose delusions while quietly accepting her constant vicious disrespect. I looked her dead in the deeply panicked eyes and delivered the absolute final verdict on our 10-year relationship. Gosh. You wanted high society, Susan? I said, my voice echoing perfectly in the silent room. Have fun explaining this massive federal criminal investigation to your elite country club friends. Susan let out a loud, agonizing wail and collapsed forward, pressing her forehead directly against the cold marble floor. She knew her social and financial execution was absolutely final. Rebecca, who had been watching her mother completely break down, finally snapped out of her own terrified paralysis. She rushed forward and aggressively grabbed my arm, yelling that I was a heartless monster for destroying their entire family. Before I could even brush Rebecca's hand away, Jamal stepped out from the shadows of the massive floral display. He gently but firmly removed his wife's hand from my arm and pushed her back. Jamal reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. The entire room held its collective breath once again. Jamal looked at Rebecca with absolute pure disgust and stepped forward, handing the heavy file directly to her trembling hands. She looked down at the thick envelope, completely confused by his sudden serious demeanor. She frantically asked him what was inside the folder, desperately hoping he was finally going to defend her against me. Jamal did not offer her a warm, comforting embrace. His deep voice resonated with absolute authority as he stared directly into her eyes. He told her to open the heavy manila file and read the contents carefully. Rebecca fumbled with the metal clasp, her hands shaking violently as she pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She stared at the bold black lettering on the very first page, and her jaw instantly dropped. Jamal turned his attention away from his terrified wife and looked out at the remaining corporate guests and wealthy investors who were still processing the massive federal raid. He projected his deep voice across the grand ballroom, ensuring every single person present clearly understood the absolute depths of his wife's betrayal. Jamal loudly announced that while Nathaniel was busy forging signatures, his loyal sister Rebecca was busy robbing her own immediate family. He revealed that over the last 6 months, Rebecca had systematically drained their 7-year-old daughter's entire college savings account. She had completely emptied the carefully managed trust fund Jamal had worked so incredibly hard to build. He explained that she secretly forged his legal signature on multiple banking authorizations and funneled every single penny directly into Nathaniel's fraudulent tech startup. She willingly sacrificed her own child's secure future just to buy her way into her brother's massive financial scheme. A collective gasp of genuine horror echoed through the room. Stealing from wealthy venture capitalists was a severe corporate crime, but stealing from your own young child was a profound moral failure that disgusted absolutely everyone. Rebecca frantically shook her head, stepping toward Jamal and desperately grabbing his tailored suit sleeve. She cried that she only did it because Nathaniel promised her a massive return on investment when the company went public tonight. She begged Jamal to understand, claiming she was just trying to build generational wealth for their family. Jamal violently yanked his arm out of her desperate grasp. He looked at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated coldness. He pointed directly at the thick stack of papers she was clutching. He informed her that the documents were highly expedited divorce papers and an emergency court order granting him immediate full physical and legal custody of their young daughter. He told her that he had already safely relocated their child to a highly secure private location completely away from her toxic influence. He explicitly stated that she was absolutely forbidden from contacting them until the federal authorities finished thoroughly investigating her direct involvement in Nathaniel's massive wire fraud scheme. Rebecca let out a shattered, heartbreaking scream and collapsed onto the polished floor right next to her completely ruined, weeping mother. Jamal did not offer her a single ounce of pity. He turned his back on the pathetic, sobbing women and took a deliberate step to stand proudly right next to me. We stood together shoulder to shoulder, the only two genuine outsiders who had ever married into this incredibly toxic, arrogant family. They had spent an entire decade constantly treating us like we were completely disposable. They had endlessly mocked our strong work ethic and our highly logical minds while lifting up a complete fraud. Now their golden empire was completely reduced to ash, and we were the only two people left standing with our wealth, our dignity, and our absolute freedom intact. I looked at Jamal and offered him a warm, genuine smile of profound mutual respect. He returned the confident smile, nodding silently. We turned our backs on the crying family and began walking together down the long velvet carpet toward the grand exit of the luxury ballroom. The wealthy investors automatically stepped aside, giving us a wide, clear path out of the absolute chaos. We walked with our heads held incredibly high, feeling the immense weight of the last 10 years finally lifting off our shoulders. As we approached the heavy oak doors leading out into the main lobby, we heard a frantic, chaotic scuffle near the coat check desk. We stopped walking and watched as Brittany desperately tried to sprint toward the glass exit doors. She was aggressively clutching two massive, incredibly expensive designer handbags against her chest, practically shoving a venue waiter out of her way. She was desperately trying to escape the legal fallout before the federal authorities realized she was completely complicit. But she did not make it very far. Two female federal agents, wearing dark tactical windbreakers, stepped directly into her path, physically blocking the exit. Brittany screamed hysterically, demanding that they move out of her way. The agents completely ignored her loud demands. One agent firmly grabbed Brittany's wrists, while the other agent yanked the two expensive designer handbags right out of her desperate grip. The lead female agent loudly informed Brittany that the luxury items were being officially confiscated as direct material evidence of embezzled corporate funds, leaving the young mistress completely empty-handed. I walked past her without a single sideways glance, finally stepping out into the crisp, cool night air, and happily leaving the entire exhausting, toxic nightmare completely behind me forever. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled, and the absolute brutal reality of the justice system had entirely crushed Nathaniel's arrogant delusions. The federal trial was swift and incredibly public. The massive mountain of forensic evidence I provided left his expensive defense attorneys with absolutely no room to maneuver. He was swiftly convicted of multiple counts of federal wire fraud and tax evasion. He was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The visionary tech billionaire was now just another federal inmate wearing a standard orange jumpsuit. His family fared absolutely no better. Because they had foolishly co-signed his fraudulent corporate loans, Richard and Susan lost absolutely everything. Their pristine suburban home was immediately foreclosed upon and sold at public auction. They were forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, completely shunned by their elite country club friends. Rebecca completely lost physical and legal custody of her daughter, just as Jamal promised. She was currently facing her own intense legal battle for knowingly transferring stolen funds across state lines. As for Brittany, the glamorous high society life she thought she had stolen vanished into thin air. Because she was directly implicated in receiving stolen corporate assets, the courts ordered her to pay massive financial restitution. She was currently working a grueling minimum wage job at a local diner just to slowly pay off her towering legal fees. She traded her designer dresses for a stained polyester uniform. While their toxic empire burned to the ground, my own life flourished beyond my wildest expectations. As the majority shareholder of the venture capital firm, I legally seized and thoroughly liquidated the remaining intellectual property and physical assets of the technology startup. By carefully selling off the valuable foundational software code to the exact same conglomerate that canceled the acquisition, I managed to effectively triple my personal wealth within a few short months. I finally had the absolute ultimate freedom to build the exact life I always deserved. I poured a significant portion of my new wealth into completely renovating my historic Victorian estate. I did not tear down the beautiful original hardwood floors or the stunning classic architecture like Brittany had arrogantly planned. Instead, I carefully restored every single room to its original breathtaking glory. Tonight, the grand dining room was glowing warmly with soft candlelight and filled with the incredibly comforting smell of a home-cooked meal. I was hosting a private dinner party, but the guest list was completely different from the terrible anniversary dinner that started this entire journey. I sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table, smiling warmly at the only two people who truly mattered. Jamal and his beautiful 7-year-old daughter were my guests of honor. Jamal looked incredibly peaceful and deeply rested. He had successfully secured full custody and was completely thriving in his banking career, without the heavy, suffocating weight of Rebecca's toxic family dragging him down. His daughter laughed brightly as she told me a story about her school project, bringing a pure, innocent joy into the house that had been missing for over a decade. We were not related by blood, but sitting there sharing a wonderful meal together, I knew we had successfully formed a real chosen family, built entirely on mutual respect, absolute honesty, and profound, unwavering support. As I listened to their happy laughter echoing off the high ceilings, I realized the most important lesson of my entire life. Sometimes the absolute greatest revenge is not screaming, matching their toxic energy, or violently destroying their reputation. The absolute greatest revenge is simply establishing an ironclad boundary and executing a massive silent success. When people severely underestimate your intelligence and disrespect your basic humanity, you do not have to loudly prove your worth to them. You just have to quietly gather your irrefutable evidence, protect your assets, and let their own blinding arrogance become their ultimate downfall. I survived their cruelty by remaining entirely silent, and today my silence is the absolute loudest victory of all. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Have you ever had to walk away from a highly toxic relationship and quietly rebuild your entire life from scratch? I would absolutely love to hear your personal stories of finding strength and setting healthy boundaries in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more true stories of resilience and justice. Remember, your greatest power is often hidden in your quietest moments. When faced with ultimate betrayal, our first instinct is usually to scream, cry, and demand an immediate explanation. We want to force the people who hurt us to understand the depths of our pain. But the story we just explored teaches us a profoundly different lesson about dealing with toxic and narcissistic individuals. The absolute greatest power you can wield against those who try to destroy you is the power of total silence and meticulous preparation. Toxic people actively thrive on your emotional reactions. They desperately want you to break down because your chaotic response validates their false sense of superiority and control. When the family tried to publicly humiliate her, they fully expected a highly theatrical meltdown. Instead, she gave them absolutely nothing. By completely withholding her emotional response, she denied them the exact satisfaction they craved, and she bought herself the most valuable asset in any conflict, which is time. She used that quiet time to think logically, gather irrefutable evidence, and build an impenetrable exit strategy. Her silence was never a sign of surrender or weakness. It was a highly calculated period of reloading. In our own lives, we often feel intense pressure to immediately defend our character when we are unfairly attacked. However, true empowerment comes from realizing that you do not owe your abusers a front-row seat to your emotional bleeding. You only owe yourself a secure and completely independent future. The ultimate victory against arrogance is not winning a loud public shouting match. It is simply stepping completely out of their way and letting their own massive ego destroy them while you walk away completely unscathed. Please share this video with someone who needs to remember their quiet strength and subscribe to the channel for more empowering stories of resilience.